In every relationship, there are unspoken connections, unnoticed gestures, little moments that go unnoticed. But what happens when those small, innocent gestures evolve into something far more consuming? What if a single, fleeting connection, the kind most would brush aside, could ignite a chain of events that forever alters the course of someone's life? Meet Lena Montgomery, a woman like many others, intelligent, driven, and well-liked. She worked a 9-to-5 job, spent her weekends with friends, and had a husband she loved. On the surface, her life seemed like the picture of stability. Yet, unbeknownst to her, she was about to become the center of a dangerous game she never saw coming. Lena's story is one of quiet unease, masked by the hustle of daily life. She arrived at work each day with a smile, interacting with her colleagues. But there was one person who watched her from the shadows, carefully observing, silently waiting. A colleague like any other, or so it seemed. His name was Nick Carter. To most, Nick was just another face in the office. He kept to himself, always polite but distant. It wasn't unusual to see him in the corner of the room, silently working at his desk, his eyes always just a little too focused, his gaze lingering a little too long. For weeks, Nick had been carefully planning his next move, all while remaining under the radar. No one suspected a thing. Then came the gifts, a flower, a box of chocolates, an anonymous note. These were the first signs of his growing affection for Lena. At first, they were small and seemingly harmless, things she could easily brush off. There was no name attached to the gifts, no clues as to who was sending them. But each one arrived with perfect timing, catching her attention just when she least expected it. She couldn't help but be intrigued, but she told herself it was nothing to worry about. After all, who could have a reason to be interested in her? Days passed. The gifts kept coming, each more thoughtful than the last, always delivered with care but always with no name. The mystery deepened, and the questions started to form in Lena's mind. Who could be doing this? Was it just an innocent gesture, or was there something more to it? As the weeks wore on, Lena's curiosity grew, but so did the unease in the pit of her stomach. The gifts were no longer simply a mystery. They had become an obsession that no one at work had noticed, until it was too late. It wasn't until one fateful afternoon at a company event when the mystery was finally revealed. Lena found herself face to face with the man behind the gifts, Nick Carter, the man who had quietly, carefully orchestrated his every move, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal himself. The charming colleague who had played the part of the distant, polite co-worker now stood before her, confessing his admiration. But this wasn't a confession born out of affection. No, it was a turning point, one that would change everything. Lena, taken aback, felt the pull of the moment. Nick was different. He was attractive, attentive, and for the first time in a long while, she felt noticed. His smile was warm, and his words seemed genuine, offering something her life had been missing. Yet something about the whole encounter felt wrong. Despite herself, Lena found herself caught up in the moment. Was she imagining things? Or was there something there? A connection, perhaps? She didn't know what it was, until the kiss. Their lips met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The kiss was brief but charged, and in that instant, Lena felt something stir inside her. It was dangerous, exciting, and yet wrong. The guilt hit her almost immediately. She was married. This wasn't what she wanted. But what was it she had wanted anyway? Lena pulled away. She couldn't let herself go down this path. She loved her husband, and yet here she was, caught in a moment with someone who wasn't him. The distance that followed seemed innocent enough, a natural consequence of that kiss. But it didn't sit right with Nick. He had crossed a line, one that Lena had unknowingly drawn. And when she pulled away, it wasn't just rejection that Nick felt. It was something far more dangerous. For him, it wasn't about the kiss. It was about control, about ownership, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back. As Lena began to distance herself, Nick's behavior began to change. What had once been innocent gestures became something far more invasive. The gifts, once charming, now seemed more like a demand for attention. He started showing up uninvited, in places he knew Lena frequented. The subtle messages, at first so sweet, now carried a hint of desperation. A desperation that Lena couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. Nick was no longer just a colleague. He had become something far more unsettling, a constant looming presence in her life. And soon his obsession would take a turn she could never have imagined. The moment Lena called in sick to work one day, it was the perfect opportunity. She was alone, vulnerable. It would be the last day anyone would see her alive. And when the truth was finally uncovered, it would leave everyone asking, how did this seemingly harmless colleague become capable of such violence? And what was it that led him to take everything Lena had away from her? This is the story of how one woman's life was quietly destroyed by a man she once thought she could trust. The story of how a seemingly innocent connection turned into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Stay with us. This is the chilling tale of Lena Montgomery, and the man who was always just a little too close for comfort. For months, Lena's life had been the picture of routine, calm, and steady, until those gifts began to arrive. The first one was simple, just a bouquet of flowers left on her desk, with no name, no explanation. She found it odd at first, but there was something undeniably flattering about the gesture. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to make her pause. Then came the chocolates, a little note attached to the ribbon. For someone as sweet as you. The words were kind, even charming in their own way. Again, there was no name, no clue as to who was behind it. Lena couldn't shake the thought that this was someone she knew, someone close enough to her life to understand what would make her smile. But who? Weeks passed, and the gifts kept coming. A small, intricately wrapped box of chocolates here, a handwritten note there, and still no name, no explanation. At first, Lena was flattered. Who wouldn't be? It felt like a secret admirer's game. But as the weeks turned into months, something began to gnaw at her. The gifts, though sweet, started to feel more like a weight, an expectation she wasn't sure how to handle. She started to feel eyes on her, watching her more closely than usual. Every glance from her colleagues now felt heavier. She'd sit at her desk, working through her tasks, and her mind would wander to the gifts. Who was behind them? Was it someone she worked with? Someone who had been in her circle all along, just waiting for the right moment to make their feelings known? Her curiosity began to grow, but so did the discomfort. The gifts weren't going away. They were showing up almost daily now, and with each one, Lena began to feel the pressure. She found herself wondering if this was some sort of joke, some strange office prank. But the gifts were too personal for that. The chocolates, the flowers, they were things she loved, things only someone close to her could know. Yet no one ever came forward. No one admitted to the gifts. Lena started to question herself. Was she overthinking it? Was she just imagining things? She confided in her closest friend at work, Rachel. "Do you think I'm being paranoid?" she asked one afternoon as they took a break in the break room, sipping coffee. Rachel, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. "I don't know, Lena. Maybe it's someone who just admires you. There's no harm in it, right? Could just be someone trying to get your attention." Lena wasn't so sure. But no one is coming forward. It's like they're hiding, Rachel. I don't know who it is, and I don't like it." Rachel laughed lightly. "You're always overthinking things. Just let it be. You'll find out who it is when they're ready to tell you." Lena tried to let it go, but the gifts kept coming. The soft whisper of the envelope as it slid across her desk. The light scent of flowers that lingered even after they'd been placed in the trash. It wasn't the gifts themselves that unsettled her. It was the anonymity, the constant presence of something, someone, just out of reach. Someone who knew her so well but still remained a mystery. She thought about it more than she should have, which only made it worse. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this person, the one who had been sending these gifts, was closer to her than she could ever imagine. Lena didn't know it yet, but the man who had been behind those gifts wasn't some distant admirer. He wasn't some far-off figure whose identity would eventually reveal itself. Number the man she least expected. The man who had been so close to her, so near every single day, was the one who had been watching her. Nick Carter, a quiet, reserved colleague, the one who always kept to himself, the one who never stood out in the crowd, the one who always seemed to fade into the background, yet whose eyes never seemed to leave her. It was Nick who had been sending the gifts all along. But Lena hadn't known that. She hadn't noticed how often he was near her, how often his gaze lingered just a little longer than it should. She hadn't noticed how he was always the one to ask if she needed help, always the one to make sure she was okay after a long day at work. She hadn't noticed the subtle cues, the quiet, almost imperceptible way he'd start a conversation with her, always finding a reason to be near. Nick had been there all along, watching, waiting for his moment. His actions, those gifts, those notes, the thoughtful gestures, were all part of a careful, calculated plan. He wasn't trying to get her attention in the way a typical admirer might. He was studying her, learning her likes, her dislikes, her habits, and slowly, but surely, he was weaving himself into the fabric of her life. Lena couldn't see it then. She couldn't see how the person she worked beside every day, the colleague she thought was harmless, was slowly becoming a presence in her life she couldn't shake. Nick was already there, too close for comfort, and he wasn't going anywhere. And so, with each passing day, Lena's life became more and more entangled in the web Nick had been weaving for months. A web that, unbeknownst to her, would soon trap her in a way she couldn't escape. It was during one of the company's monthly gatherings that Lena found herself face to face with Nick outside the confines of the office. The setting was casual, employees mingling over drinks, laughter filling the room as people loosened up after another busy week. But for Lena, it felt different. The air seemed heavier. The laughter around her faded as she locked eyes with Nick, who was standing alone at the edge of the room, watching her. For weeks, she had tried to ignore the feeling that lingered whenever she crossed paths with him. The polite smiles, the small talk, they were nothing more than fleeting moments. But tonight, it felt different. There was a tension between them now that couldn't be ignored. Nick made his way over, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an unmistakable warmth, a confidence that was new and unsettling. As he approached Lena, his words were slow, deliberate, as if he had been rehearsing them in his head. "I wanted to tell you something," Nick said, his voice low and steady. "I've been sending you the gifts." Lena was taken aback. The words hung in the air between them, the weight of them sinking in slowly. The realization hit her like a shock to the system, but there was something about the way Nick said it, so openly, so calmly, that caught her off guard. He wasn't hiding behind a mask of anonymity anymore. I didn't want to be just another face in the crowd, Nick continued. I wanted you to know. You're special to me. You've always been special. Lena didn't know how to respond. She felt a flutter of surprise mixed with something else, something she couldn't name. There was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, a quiet confidence that drew her in, even as her mind screamed to pull away. The conversation flowed, easy and natural. For the first time in months, Lena felt like she was seen, not just as a colleague, a wife, but as a person. Nick listened, really listened, to what she said. He asked about her interests, her dreams, the things she rarely spoke about. She found herself laughing, her walls slowly coming down. The night wore on, and as the conversation deepened, so did the unspoken connection between them. The lines between colleague and something more began to blur, and for the first time in a long time, Lena felt a spark. Something that hadn't been there in her marriage for a while. It was intoxicating, like the first drop of rain on dry ground, awakening something inside her. And then it happened. In the middle of the conversation, their eyes met again. It wasn't planned. It wasn't forced. It was just natural. Nick leaned in, and without thinking, Lena's lips brushed against his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but then deeper, more urgent. For a moment, everything else faded away. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a connection, a thread that pulled her in, making her forget the world around her. For the first time in months, Lena felt a rush of excitement, a thrill she hadn't felt in years. She felt alive, desired, seen in a way she hadn't known she needed. But the moment was fleeting. As quickly as it had begun, Lena pulled away. The world around her came rushing back into focus, and with it, the weight of reality. Her husband, her vows, the life she had built. The guilt hit her like a tidal wave, overwhelming and suffocating. She couldn't do this. She couldn't betray everything she had for a fleeting moment of excitement. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice shaking. I can't. I'm married. Nick stood there frozen, confusion flashing across his face. He didn't move, didn't say anything for a long moment. I understand, he finally said, his voice almost too calm. His eyes were darker now, something unreadable lurking beneath the surface. Lena stepped back, the distance between them suddenly feeling like an ocean. She turned, walking away from him, her heart pounding in her chest. But even as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And as much as she wanted to forget about it, the pull of Nick's attention, the magnetic force between them, kept drawing her back in. But this wasn't just about a kiss. It wasn't just about a moment of weakness. It was the beginning of something darker, something she couldn't see yet. As Lena pulled back, she unknowingly set the stage for the worst decision of Nick's life, a decision that would change everything. The gift giver, the admirer, the quiet, attentive colleague. For Nick, it wasn't about a kiss. It was about control, about claiming something that had always been just out of reach. And for Lena, it was too late to walk away. What would have been a simple turning point in their relationship would soon become a dangerous escalation. An escalation that would take Lena to a place she never imagined, until it was too late to escape. After that night, everything changed. Lena tried to go back to her normal routine, tried to brush off what had happened between her and Nick as nothing more than a fleeting moment. But the truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The kiss, the connection, something inside her had shifted. Yet despite the pull she felt, Lena was determined to stay true to her marriage. She loved her husband, and she couldn't allow herself to be swept away by a moment of weakness. So Lena tried to distance herself from Nick. She avoided him at work, kept conversations short, and when he tried to reach out through text or calls, she didn't respond. The silence from her side should have been enough for him to get the message, but it wasn't. Nick didn't take rejection well. Where Lena had hoped for space and clarity, Nick saw something else, a challenge. Each ignored text only seemed to fuel his determination. He started showing up at her favorite coffee shop, a place Lena frequented to escape the office's hum, to have some time for herself. The first time it happened, she thought it was a coincidence. After all, the world wasn't that small. But soon, it became clear that Nick was tracking her movements. Lena would sit at the small window table, quietly sipping her coffee when she'd see him. At first, he'd simply wave from across the room, a smile on his face as though everything was perfectly normal. But as the weeks wore on, he started getting closer. It wasn't just a casual wave anymore. He'd walk in and sit at a table near hers, always a little too close for comfort, always watching her from behind the rim of his coffee cup. It wasn't just the coffee shop. He began to appear at other places she frequented. The grocery store, the park near her home. Lena would see him in the distance, just far enough away that she couldn't be certain he was following her, but close enough to make her feel uneasy. Every time she caught a glimpse of him, her heart would race, the gnawing sense of paranoia creeping in. And it wasn't just his presence. The gifts started again, more frequent, more elaborate. Flowers, chocolates, little trinkets she hadn't asked for. Notes, always short, always signed with a single word: Nick. Each note, each gift, seemed to push her further into a corner, leaving her with the nagging feeling that she couldn't escape. Lena tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was harmless, that he was just a man who had gotten carried away. But as the days passed, she became more and more unsettled. It wasn't just the fact that Nick was sending these gifts or showing up at places she frequented. It was the feeling of being watched, of never being truly alone. Every glance over her shoulder felt like it might reveal Nick lurking nearby, just out of sight. She confided in Rachel, her closest friend, about the growing unease. "Rachel, something isn't right," Lena said one evening as they sat at their usual table in the break room. "Nick is everywhere. He's following me. I see him at the coffee shop. I see him walking down the street when I go to the store. It's like he's always there." Rachel looked at her, her brow furrowed. "Lena, come on. You're overthinking this. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe he's just being friendly. He's probably just harmless. You're overreacting." But Lena wasn't sure. There was a gut feeling in her that told her this wasn't normal behavior. It wasn't just friendly gestures anymore. It was obsessive, invasive. She started to feel the weight of it, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The lines between colleague and stalker were blurring, and Lena wasn't sure how to stop it. The situation escalated further when one evening, Lena left her office later than usual. As she walked to her car, she saw him standing by the corner, hands in his pockets, just watching her. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It was as if he was daring her to confront him. "What are you doing here?" Lena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Nick smiled. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he said, his tone far too casual, like this was just a normal part of their routine. "I thought I'd walk you to your car." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "No, Nick," she said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. "I don't need you to walk me to my car. I don't need your help." Nick's smile didn't falter. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the heat of his body. "I'm just trying to be there for you, Lena. I care about you. Don't you see that?" Lena's pulse quickened. This wasn't the friendly colleague she had worked with. This was something else entirely, something she couldn't ignore any longer. She backed away, her eyes darting to the parking lot, hoping no one else was around to witness the confrontation. "I don't want you to be here," Lena said firmly, trying to hold back the panic that was threatening to rise in her throat. "Leave me alone, Nick." Nick didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at her, his expression unreadable. But before she could say anything more, he turned, walking away without a word. As Lena got into her car and drove home that night, her thoughts raced. What had just happened? How had everything gotten so out of control? She had tried to pull away. She had tried to ignore him. But Nick wasn't taking no for an answer. She felt trapped, her world shrinking around her with each passing day, suffocated by his presence, by his need to claim her. And yet, Lena still didn't fully understand the extent of the danger Nick posed. She didn't see it then, but it was coming, just beyond the horizon, waiting to catch her completely off guard. She was no longer just dealing with a coworker. She was dealing with an obsession. And this obsession was growing stronger by the day. It was a quiet morning when Lena made the decision to call in sick. The kind of day when the world outside seemed to move on without her, a stillness that felt almost peaceful. She had woken up feeling unwell, a minor cold that left her with a slight fever and a headache. It wasn't unusual, but something about the solitude of the day brought with it a sense of foreboding. She spent the morning in bed, resting, her thoughts wandering to the strange turn her life had taken in recent weeks. The presence of Nick, his constant following, the gifts, and his unwavering pursuit. It was all becoming too much. The silence of the house should have been a comfort, but it was only a reminder that she was alone, that no one would be there to see what was about to unfold. As the hours passed, Lena tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if she could sense that the calm would soon be shattered, and she was right. By mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang. Lena was still in her pajamas, curled up on the couch, trying to get some rest. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her first thought was that it might be a delivery or a neighbor checking in. But when she opened the door, the last person she expected to see stood before her. Nick. He was standing there, a half smile on his face, as if his presence was nothing out of the ordinary. "I thought I'd check in on you," he said, his tone casual, as if this was a perfectly normal visit. Lena froze for a moment, her pulse quickening. "Nick, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was already racing. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending that this wasn't a problem. Nick's smile faltered for only a second, before his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay. You've been distant lately," he said, stepping forward without invitation. His eyes, though soft in appearance, seemed to carry a hidden weight, something darker beneath the surface. Lena stepped back instinctively, her unease deepening. "I told you I'm fine. You shouldn't be here," she said firmly, trying to make him understand that his presence was no longer welcome. But Nick didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he pushed past the threshold, stepping into her house as if he had every right to be there. "I don't understand," he continued, his voice rising with frustration. "You kissed me, Lena. You pulled away, and I don't get it. You told me you cared. What changed? What's going on in your head?" Lena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The questions felt too personal, too invasive. The anger in his voice was unmistakable, but there was something more there too. A sense of entitlement, as though he believed that his feelings should take priority over everything else. His eyes were wide now, his body tense, and Lena could see the shift in him, the calm demeanor unraveling. "I never wanted this," Lena said, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to lead you on, Nick. I'm married. This isn't right." Nick's face darkened, his frustration now turning into something more dangerous. "You think you can just push me away like that? You think you can just forget about me?" His words were harsh now, the restraint that had once defined him completely gone. Before Lena could react, before she could even take another step back, Nick lunged forward. His hands gripped her throat, and for a moment the world went silent around her. She gasped for air, her hands flying to his, trying to pull them away, but his grip only tightened. Her vision began to blur, and panic seized her chest. This wasn't the Nick she had known, a quiet, polite colleague. This was a man consumed by something far darker, something she had never seen before. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Nick released her, and Lena fell to the ground, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. Her hands were trembling as she clutched at her throat, trying to regain control of herself, trying to understand what had just happened. Nick stood over her, watching her struggle to breathe. His expression was unreadable, but there was no remorse in his eyes, only cold determination. "You don't understand, Lena," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You never understood what I've done for you, what I've sacrificed for you." Lena tried to speak, but her voice was weak, choked. "Please, Nick, this isn't you." But it didn't matter. Nick wasn't hearing her anymore. In his mind, something had already shifted, something had snapped. The boundaries were no longer there, and in his mind, there was no turning back. Without a word, he moved toward the tool shed in the corner of the garage, a place he had become familiar with during his many visits to her house. There, among the assortment of tools, was a saw. It was her husband's saw, the one he used for various projects around the house. Nick had seen it many times before. He knew how it worked. He knew how to use it. And in that moment, it became the instrument of his rage. Lena didn't see him approach again. She was too weak, too disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. But when she felt the cold steel of the saw against her skin, she understood. It was over. The pain was sharp, but it was fleeting. It was the last thing Lena would ever feel. Nick didn't stop there. He methodically began to dismember her body, the gruesome act carried out with a cold, calculating precision. It wasn't just about silencing her anymore. It was about covering his tracks. He knew what needed to be done to make this look like something it wasn't. When he was done, he carefully arranged the scene. He placed the saw near her body, deliberately positioning it in a way that would implicate her husband, making it look like a violent outburst, a crime of passion that had gone too far. He wiped away all traces of his presence, leaving behind only the evidence that would lead the police to the wrong conclusion. When everything was in place, he left the house as if nothing had happened. He walked away, his heart steady, his mind clear. There was no guilt, no remorse, just the certainty that he had done what he needed to do. Lena was gone, and now Nick would make sure the world would think it was her husband who had killed her. The life he had once hoped to build with her was gone, but in his twisted mind, this was the only way to make her his forever. And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The house was eerily quiet when Ethan arrived home that evening. He had been working late, the day dragging on longer than usual. When he walked through the door, he expected to find his wife, Lena, waiting for him as she always did. What he didn't expect was the horrific scene that would greet him. The silence was deafening as he stepped inside. A strange smell lingered in the air, But it wasn't until he reached the living room that his world would come crashing down. There, in the center of the room, was the sight he would never be able to erase from his mind. His wife's body, dismembered, lay in a grotesque and incomprehensible display of violence. He staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The walls seemed to close in on him, the room spinning. He couldn't comprehend what his eyes were seeing. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened. How could this be real? For a moment, time seemed to stand still. His heart was pounding, his hands trembling. He screamed her name, as though somehow calling out to her could undo the horror that unfolded before him. But Lena didn't answer. She never would again. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone, dialing emergency services with shaking hands. The words were difficult to form, his voice barely audible. It's Lena. She's gone. She's dead." He couldn't find the strength to say anything more. The police arrived within minutes, and the scene became a blur of flashing lights, uniforms, and sterile, clinical assessments. They quickly began to process the area, looking for clues that might explain the unimaginable. As they combed through the house, it became clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. The scene was carefully staged. The saw, bloodied and discarded, was found near Lena's body, placed deliberately in a way that pointed to Ethan's involvement. The police noted the obvious signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, broken glass, and smudged fingerprints leading to and from the body. The investigators wasted no time in focusing on the most obvious lead. Ethan. He was her husband. The DNA found on the saw was his. His fingerprints were on the weapon. There were signs of an argument, violent enough to suggest something personal had occurred. The police quickly theorized that Ethan was responsible for his wife's gruesome death. They questioned him relentlessly, their gaze fixed on him with suspicion. Ethan, still in shock, couldn't make sense of the accusations. His mind was clouded with grief, but in his heart, he knew he hadn't done this. He had loved Lena. He still loved her. His world was crumbling around him, and yet he could feel that something was terribly wrong with the case. There were cracks in the story the police were constructing, things that didn't quite add up. Why would he kill her? Why would he go so far as to dismember her body and leave it for anyone to find? Nothing about this made sense. He felt like a man drowning, struggling to explain the truth that no one was willing to hear. The investigators were sure they had the right man. The evidence seemed damning, overwhelming. But Ethan knew with an unshakable certainty, that he wasn't the one who had taken his wife's life. Something was wrong with the picture, but it would take time, and the truth, before anyone would uncover the full story. The investigation had only just begun, and with every new discovery it seemed the mystery grew deeper, more complex. The question now was, who really killed Lena Montgomery? The case against Ethan seemed airtight, but there was something that didn't sit right with investigators. The crime scene was brutal, yet methodically staged. It felt too deliberate, too clean, almost as if someone wanted Ethan to take the fall. As detectives combed through the evidence, a new lead emerged. Security cameras from a neighboring house captured an unexpected figure near Lena's home on the day of the murder. A man seen lingering outside, pacing, watching. When the footage was enhanced, his identity became clear. Nick Larson. Nick had been careful, but not careful enough. The timestamp on the footage placed him near Lena's home hours before Ethan even returned. And it wasn't just the security footage that raised suspicions. Investigators began digging deeper into Lena's last days, reviewing messages, emails, and call logs. That's when they discovered something disturbing. Lena had confided in her close friend Rachel about someone following her, someone sending gifts, someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. Rachel admitted that Lena had mentioned a colleague, someone charming at first, but increasingly persistent. A man who had made her feel special, until she no longer wanted his attention. The gifts became a crucial piece of the puzzle. A forensic analysis traced them back to a single store, one where purchases had been made using a credit card linked to none other than Nick Larson. It was the break detectives needed. They searched Nick's apartment, looking for anything that could connect him to Lena beyond work. What they found was chilling. Hidden away in his closet was a collection of photos, notes, and keepsakes. Tokens of his obsession with Lena. Old receipts for the gifts. A copy of her house key, stolen from her office months earlier. And in his trash bin, a pair of gloves, covered in microscopic traces of Lena's blood. Then came the psychological evaluation. Experts reviewed Nick's history and behavior. He was charismatic, intelligent, well-liked. But underneath he had a profile that fit a disturbing pattern. A man obsessed with control, who could not accept rejection. Nick had spent months building a fantasy in his mind, believing that Lena was meant to be with him. When she rejected him, that fantasy shattered. And when the illusion broke, so did he. The investigation unearthed the shocking truth. The man who had once been a charming colleague was now the most dangerous kind of predator, obsessed and willing to destroy everything for love. And now the real question was, would justice be served? Nick Larson thought he had done everything right. He had erased his tracks, staged the scene, and pinned the blame on a man who never saw it coming. But what he hadn't counted on was the one thing killers always overlook. The truth always finds its way out. As investigators pieced together the final details, they issued a warrant for Nick's arrest. But Nick had already sensed the walls closing in. He packed a bag, withdrew a substantial amount of cash, and made his way toward the outskirts of town. He wasn't fleeing permanently, just long enough for the heat to die down, for the suspicion to shift elsewhere. He didn't make it far. Detectives tracked his movements through his credit card transactions, his phone's location history, and the rental car he had hastily secured. Highway patrol officers were given his description, and just 30 miles outside of the city, they spotted him. A traffic stop turned into an arrest. The man who had been so meticulous, so careful, was pulled from his vehicle and taken into custody, without incident. Back at the station, confronted with overwhelming evidence, Nick maintained his innocence. He insisted that the surveillance footage was a coincidence, that the gifts were nothing more than friendly gestures, that the DNA evidence was contamination. But the walls were closing in, and his carefully constructed lies began to crumble. Ethan Montgomery, the man who had just days ago been sitting in a holding cell, was now a free man. But exoneration did not bring relief. It didn't undo the nightmares, the accusations, the knowledge that his wife had been taken from him in such a brutal way. The damage was permanent. Lena's family was left with a grief too heavy to carry. The daughter they had raised, the woman who had brought light to so many, had been reduced to a headline, a case file, a cautionary tale, a life stolen by a man who claimed to love her. In the end, it wasn't a jealous husband or an angry lover, but a man whose obsession drove him to the darkest extremes. The lines between admiration and madness were blurred, and it cost Lena Montgomery everything. Nick Larson was sentenced to life in prison, but justice could not undo what had been done. It could not bring Lena back. It could not erase the horror of that day. And for those left behind, the only thing more terrifying than what happened to Lena was how easily it could happen again. Lena Montgomery's story is one that leaves behind more questions than answers. How could admiration turn into something so dangerous? How does a person cross the line from infatuation to destruction? Her family would later share that Lena had expressed discomfort in the weeks leading up to her death. In her private journal, she had written, "I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but something doesn't feel right." It was a fear she kept hidden, a warning sign ignored, and in the end, it was a feeling that was tragically real. Obsession is often mistaken for love. But love is safe. It is mutual. It does not instill fear. The importance of boundaries, of recognizing the red flags of stalking and manipulation, cannot be understated. If you or someone you know is experiencing unwanted attention, if your gut tells you something isn't right, speak up. No one should have to live under constant surveillance, weighed down by fear. What do you think about this case? Could something have been done to prevent it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help bring awareness to the dangers of obsession. Thank you for watching.